It's a happy day for me, and I wish to share the happiness with all and each of you. And let me tell you why. Earlier this afternoon, we held the annual general meeting reflecting on the past working year of the Club of Rome EU chapter. In 2012, it was the 10th anniversary of the foundation of what was then called the Brusselse groep van de Club van Rome, the Brussels group of the Club of Rome. It was an initiative of Professor Raoul Weiler, and I'm pleased to greet him, supported by Erika de Kuyper, who sits somewhere there, and some others who I don't see at this moment. 2 years later, in 2004, Your Royal Highness agreed to become our honorary president. And we are most grateful for nearly 10 years of your loyal and stimulating support. And next year, Highness, we should pay you a special tribute, but maybe then we will have to address you as Your Majesty. At any rate, on behalf of the board and all members of the Club of Rome EU chapter, I should like to thank you for your presence at all our academic sessions, in spite of your many international trade missions and a hectic agenda as far as I can see. Today's session has a particular significance, and that's another reason for my happiness. We are privileged to share some thoughts about the meaning of the Club of Rome's mission and action with two very distinguished personalities. Both have outstanding scientific background and experience, but also an impressive record of action on the field. They are people of conviction, high ethical standards, and remarkable commitment in their professional life. They have a deep sense of family life and of the common good. The first guest speaker is a long-standing member of the International Club of Rome, elected last October co-president. And the second guest, of course, will be a honorary member later this afternoon. Both are actors of change and positive transformation in a globalized world where mainstream opinion is one of gloom and doom. Ernst von Weizsäcker's academic background is chemistry, physics, and biology. I met him in the early 70s when we were both involved in a small, rather unknown alternative group of emerging green thinkers and activists. The group was called Eco-Europa, Ecologica Europa. It's still alive and kicking, though you don't see much of it. From 1975 to 1980, Ernst was president of the Gesamthochschule in Kassel. But being also a man of action, he organized there one of the most significant conferences for the rising environmental movement in Europe. And we had the privilege listening to fascinating scientists like Nicolas Georgescu-Roegen and visionaries like Ivan Illich and Orio Giarini. His career has been varied and successful in different areas. He was director of the Center for Economy and Technique at the United Nations in New York, before leading and managing the Institut für Europäische Umweltpolitik in Bonn. Thereafter, he was founder and president of the famous Wuppertal Institut für Klima, Umwelt und Energie. In 1998, he was elected member of the Deutsche Bundestag, where he chaired the Select Committee, Globalization of the World Economy, if I'm not mistaken, and the Committee on Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety. And this was until 2005, when he was appointed Dean of the Brennan School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of California. He is the author of several books, among which Factor 4, followed by Factor 5. They demonstrate how we can double wealth by halving resource use. Limits to Privatization is also recommended reading, not the least these days. Like many among us, Ernst feels that all over the world, democracy is being deconstructed. And one of the main causes is the unbridled liberalization of the world as a marketplace. Being a biologist, Professor van Weizsäcker knows something about the importance of balance and limits. Putting limits to privatization is one of the means to curb the present trend, which is leading to further depletion of the planet, to social misery, to starvation and conflict. Putting limits to privatization will contribute to restoring democracy, we believe. Today, co-chairing the Club of Rome Worldwide, he is refocusing and rejuvenating this 40-year-old club. Some say club of old men, but we have an increasing number of women among us, I'm glad to say. And so we are most grateful to him for sharing his views how the club can and should contribute not only to save our one and unique blue planet, but making it a better place to live for the majority of humankind. And let me close this introductory remark by telling you that Ernst is also an excellent cook. It proves something about the taste for life. And if time would allow, during the reception, you can always try to get his recipe of his famous game preparation called Jägerlatein. Ernst, thank you for being with us. The floor is yours.
Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear Mark, I feel greatly honored being here and trying to give you some impressions on what the Club of Rome has been and what it should be. I don't have a blueprint with me, but at least some ideas. So, this is basically the outline, and I'm starting with the history and controversies about the limits to growth. Well, it all started with Aurelio Peccei, the industrialist from Italy, coming together with then very high official of the OECD, Alexander King, and then they had a common friend, Eduard Festel, who was the, I believe at the time already Minister for Education in Lower Saxony, and he was also sitting on the Volkswagen Foundation, so he was the money source for the Club of Rome. And then there were three geniuses of systems analysis, Hasan Özbekan from Turkey, Erich Jansch from Austria, and Alexander Christakis, originally from Greece and later America. They wrote a proposal called The Predicament of Mankind, which was the first paradigmatic program for the Club of Rome. And then another member of the Club of Rome was J. Forrester, who worked at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he came together with the systems analysis team, and they thought that perhaps by having 5 major parameters mutually related and linked, and then have a systems representation of the world, that would allow us to predict the future. And then, you know, it was the early times of admiration for mathematics. And then they did the mathematics with the help of a program called Dynamo by J. Forrester, and he got a team of young people led by the Meadows couple, Donella Meadows and Dennis Meadows, standing right from J. Forrester, and then Jürgen Randers, who is now one of the famous authors of Club of Rome book, and William Beres. And they together got the limits to growth study with collapse scenarios under business as usual assumptions, including a permanent coupling of those 5 key parameters. Now, of course, the coupling was the mistake. For instance, a firm coupling between industrial output and pollution. At the time, empirically, it was correct, but it was the beginning of the environmental movement and environmental policy. In 1972, the EU, at the time European Economic Commission, I believe, was scheming to do environmental policy, which was unheard of at the time. And then, after 10 years or so, the two parameters were decoupled. So, by definition, in a sense, this strict coupling of parameters made the whole model wrong. Nevertheless, it had a huge impact on the world. 40 years later, some people look back and say, a book that launched a movement, and Limits to Growth really changed the mindset in Western countries. And when leading figures such as Alexander King or Aurelio Peccei or so wanted to see the head of government of, what was it, Finland, Germany, USA, Japan or so, they would find open doors. It was really the new innovation. But then soon came the so-called optimists. John Maddox said, this whole Limits to Growth story is pessimistic. And he launched an attack against pessimism. I mean, he was the editor of Nature. And there was Julian Simon, the notorious optimist who turned everything optimistic. Everything will get better. I bet on it. Okay. And then John Tilton, geologist, who said, look, the Earth crust is worth for another 120 million years of copper use under today's consumption rates. While in the Club of Rome, it was 50 years. So he said, it's empirically completely wrong. So let's be optimists. And then what was worse for the message of the Limits to Growth was the oil crisis, first 1973 and then again 78, and the so-called stagflation. The red arrow shows the period of stagflation, which meant inflation and stagnation. And they had the so-called misery index, which was inflation rates plus unemployment rates. And that was, of course, a horror. And people got desperate, wanting more growth again. And then, of course, there was the Thatcher and Reagan revolution, and the two hated limits to growth. Explicitly, Ronald Reagan said, there are no such things as limits to growth, and got a lot of applause for it, of course. And then in an obituary statement on Reagan, Thatcher said, others saw only limits to growth. He transformed a stagnant economy into an engine of opportunity. So these two really were, in a sense, the adversaries or enemies of the Club of Rome. And they changed the mindset again, but in the opposite direction. And the world got growth and forgot the message of limits to growth. And that growth was in parallel with growth of energy consumption. And all this created the image of the club as being gloomy, bizarre, old men, false predictions, etc. So these are some press cuttings. There were some favorable as well. But basically, the image was negative. At a time when the club continued to produce more reports, and nearly none of them was really gloomy. They were mostly about solutions. There is the limits to privatization. But much more publicity was received by the updates to the limits to growth, although they were not reports at the Club of Rome. And the updates contained a stabilization scenario, that was number 9 for some reason, and then the trouble was, stabilization was only achieved by strict limiting of population and industrial output. Now imagine telling the world, well, you can't have more children and industrial output has to be limited. So that was not very popular either. Now, at a much later stage, 40 years after Limits to Growth, Jürgen Randers, one of the co-authors of the old book, came up with the 2052 book, which says, 40 years after Limits to Growth, I am writing what's going to happen 40 years after today, which is 2052. And this was basically a good analysis. using mostly the same methodology and with some relatively optimistic outlooks, including a stabilization of population of the world at not much more than 8 billion. And it was certainly contributing to a better image of the club. Now, next, of course, Aurelio Peccei, he was the founding president for nearly 16 years. I met him in New York in 1984. And he was already ill, but he was still a fantastic visionary. But then he died, and his friend and colleague Alexander King took over. And then a couple of years later, Dr. Ricardo Díaz-Hochleitner from Spain became the president. He made the club very popular in Spain and other Mediterranean countries and got royal families on board. The secretariat at the time, it used to be in Paris, but then there were certain troubles with the then Secretary General who had to be dismissed, and then finally the secretariat moved to Hamburg. Uwe Möller became the new Secretary General and did, with a minimal budget, a fabulous work of just making the Club of Rome survive. And we had wonderful annual conferences. And then His Royal Highness Prince El Hassan bin Talal, son of the earlier king, Talal, of Jordania, became the president. And he, of course, intensified the north-south dimensions. He also held a wonderful conference in Amman, and there he invited Near East people to understand what had happened in South Africa. So he invited people to really think of social change. And then when working with the Secretariat in Hamburg, they invented kind of the desert tech idea of having solar energy from the Sahara coming into Europe, but also helping development, economic development in North Africa. And then we had a wonderful dream team between my dear friend Ashok Khosla, with whom I'm co-chairing the International Resource Panel, and Eberhard von Körber, an industrialist from Germany living in Switzerland, and they were then the co-presidents, and the Secretariat moved to Winterthur in Switzerland. And now we have a new team. Anders Wijkman is, of course, known to most of this Brussels community, a wonderful man. He was a member of the European Parliament from Sweden, and really a fabulous asset to the club. And Ian Johnson, former vice president of the World Bank, is serving as Secretary General. So this just to tell you that there were some changes of government and inside the Club of Rome. Now, new reports, new momentum. The former co-presidents, meaning Eberhard von Körber and Ashok Khosla and Ian Johnson, had worked hard to reanimate the club. New reports, new members, new national associations, including in particular in India and now in China. And they also persuaded Jürgen Randers, knowing that he was writing a book as the third update, but not as a report to the Club of Rome. They persuaded him to make it a report to the Club of Rome. And it became a major media success. Other reports include Building the Blue Economy with Gunther Pauli, who was here as the speaker for the Aurelio Peccei lectures a couple of weeks ago. Wonderful man, really inspirational. And his book has been translated 38 times. It's unbelievable. And he's now setting up a new office in Brussels. They have one in Paris. He's mostly in South Africa. Sometimes he's in Tokyo. Sometimes he's in Colombia or in Ghana, wherever you never can really trace him. But it's fantastic how the blue economy, with 100 examples, could perhaps create 100 million jobs worldwide, chiefly by cascading materials and energy through the systems, and always creating jobs. And then my own book, together with an Australian team, Factor 5, which was mentioned by Mark, and Anders Wijkman and Johan Rockström, did a wonderful study on bankrupting nature by looking at the parallelity, the similarity between the crazy mentality of bankers during the last 10 years or so, causing a terrible turmoil, and the way we treat nature. And this only leads to bankruptcy. And then 2 weeks ago, we launched a new report by the Italian professor Ugo Bardi, chemist and geologist, on the plundering of the planet. Essentially, he's agreeing with John Tilton that a lot of copper and other things are around there in the Earth's crust. But as they get thinner, the extraction causes a lot more pollution and uses a lot more energy. So it's not responsible to accelerate this mining business. And then here I see Bernard Littár, who wrote a wonderful publication by the Club of Rome on money and sustainability, deploring, of course, the missing link between money and sustainability. He is here, and I greet him with particular pleasure. And the next report will be by Claude Martin, the former Director General of the WWF, and it's about tropical forests. And then a new chapter has been opened to the Club of Rome by a young Chinese fellow. Some people say he may be a princeling, I don't know, but anyway, I met him in Shanghai, and he is the head of CEFC, China Energy Fund Committee, and allows us and invites us to have an annual Club of Rome conference in China. And he's also asking us to have Chinese language skills in the Club of Rome, which is a good thing. Now, this is a bit about his two organizations, and we are getting money from the NGO part of it, not from the money-making thing. And the NGO is doing other philanthropic things, such as a dialogue at New York, at United Nations offices, on Confucianism and Christianity. So I think we are in good company. Now, coming back to the limits to growth story, how can we sell its truth at a time when everybody wants growth? I mean, there is, of course, the BRICS countries. I just spoke with Connie Hedegaard about in the climate negotiations, you call them basic, but it's essentially the same clan. And they say, growth, 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 that's what we want. And everybody actually outside BRICS says, oh, hopefully they come back to their old growth rates of 10% or so, because then we can sell our goods. So it seems to be consensus. And then David Cameron has been invited, together with the Liberian and Indonesian presidents, to do the report on the post-2015 development agenda. And the motto essentially is growth. They call it sustainable growth and say it's to overcome poverty. But essentially what it is growth. And how about the critics of today's politics? There is, for instance, Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman, who says, we need more public spending under today's conditions of indebtedness in order to create growth. That's the critics. And then look at the agenda of the European Council, a bit more than a week's time. Well, of course, you have to look at this last semester, and you look at the progress on the banking union and so on. But then the third element is efforts to boost competitiveness, jobs, and growth. Now, with the exception perhaps of Bhutan, I don't know any country not subscribing to policies of promising more growth. I don't blame anybody, to be sure, but I have to recognize in my capacity as co-president of the Club of Rome that our old message meets with limited enthusiasm. It's a fact. So, despite all this enthusiasm for growth, the fact cannot be denied that under today's consumption rates, we are running into disaster. If everybody reaches American kind of lifestyles, and that's what they all want. We need 5 planets Earth, but we've got only 1. What then? What's the new message if the old one is not so popular? Well, I suppose the only realistic answer is decoupling. We have reached decoupling. I spoke about that in the context of environmental policy, the so-called environmental Kuznets curve. So it ends up rich and clean, which is fabulous. But how about climate? Connie Hedegaard knows that. So far, there is a strict correlation between GDP and CO2 intensity. Look at this curve. And more or less the same is for material intensity. The richer, the more turnover of materials. So, what we better try to do is a Kuznets curve of decarbonization, and then assist developing countries tunneling through, because if they first go into the dirty hill, it will be too late for most of our climate problems. And the same with dematerialization and also tunneling through. A 5-fold increase of resource productivity would allow high prosperity with small footprints. And then our 1 planet Earth would suffice. And that's essentially the message of Factor 5. But that's nothing less than the ambition of creating a green Kondratiev cycle, meaning a technologically led growth cycle. That after 5 brown cycles, which made it worse for the environment, the first one giving relief to the environment. Now the question is a 5-fold increase of resource productivity realistic? Well, I cannot give any public speech without asking this question from physics. Imagine Mount Everest, 8,800 meters. And now you have a 10 kilograms weight, a rucksack or a bucket of water. How many kilowatt hours would you need to lift that to the top of Mount Everest? Your Royal Highness, would you know? Not necessarily. Look, when I asked my students in California, they would say 10,000 kilowatt hours, or 1,000 at least. Okay, the answer is 1/4 of a kilowatt hour. It's a huge surprise. But it's this elementary physics. You can really calculate it through. Meaning that our imagination of what a kilowatt hour can do is wrong by a factor of 1,000. So I'm not asking for a 1,000-fold increase of resource productivity. I'm only asking for a factor of 5, so I'm a very modest man. But I wanted to have this in your minds in order to understand that it is not a matter of physics that prevents us from becoming 5 times better. So let's have a look at some technologies. For instance, Volkswagen is producing, or at least have a concept of the XL1, which is 5 times more fuel efficient than typical cars today. And the so-called passive houses using passive solar energy and first-class insulation and heat exchange ventilation. My family and I are living in such a house with fabulous air quality, and the topic of heating costs has disappeared from our family talks. We have no heating costs to mention. And from 12-lane highways to bicycle-centered, Connie Hedegaard knows that, Copenhagen, you know. And Copenhagen has made a commitment of becoming climate neutral by, 2025 or so? Imagine that for Atlanta. Now, Atlanta is 25 times larger than Barcelona, but has a smaller population. Imagine you were in charge of public transport in Atlanta. In America, I would say it's dead on arrival. Can't possibly win. then the LEDs, and then cement today is mostly Portland cement on limestone, which is hugely energy intensive. You can use waste products from steel manufacturing, from coal power plants, etc., fly ash or slag or whatever, and then you need only 1/5 of the energy, and then, of course, recycling concrete and cement. Strawberry yogurt, a crazy story. We did that at the Wuppertal Institute. And then, of course, from planned obsolescence to the performance economy. This is Walter Starhill, a new member of the Club of Rome. I just spoke with Gunther Pauli, who showed me a stack of cards which were made from stone instead of from wood, with some plastic residues. It's fantastic. Now, rethinking economics. Decoupling is technically possible, but it does not happen because it's not really profitable. The returns on investment figures are poor compared to laying off workers. So we have a lot of unemployment and little improvement on resource productivity. The reason is simple. Resources got cheaper over 200 years. Prices don't tell the truth. The decades of explosive energy and material growth were the decades of rapidly falling commodity prices. And America is dreaming again of an age of cheap energy and inviting all Europeans to do the same crazy things. While we keep wasting resources, unemployment is rising. Stupid, says EU Commissioner Yanis Potočnik. We must shift emphasis from labor productivity to resource productivity, and right he is. There's something profoundly wrong with our economy. It leads to wasting resources and make millions jobless. And the young are getting angry at the Wall Street logic. Graham Maxton, I met him last week in Vienna, fellow of the Club of Rome, shows how modern economics has failed us. It falsely uses Adam Smith, who could have been among the protesters today. And 100 years after the tragedy of the Titanic, the Club of Rome organized a Change the Course conference in Winterthur with some 80 bright young people from around the world, and they had Graham Maxton as one of their main speakers. And he was still full of excitement about this young generation of people not accepting business as usual. As the club is engaging in a major decoupling project, it will also have to include profound analysis of economics and its fallacies. So, brings me to the end. Outside the academic economics question, we shall also address the challenges of long-term perspectives, making prices tell the truth, a coalition of the willing on climate, not only, rebalancing public and private goods, and engage the young generation. We have a number of new members of the Club of Rome, from which I expect a lot of interesting new initiatives. 2 power women, Marianne Bosezan and Hunter Lovins, both engaged in long-term financial and sustainable business policies. Fabulous people, I know them. The decoupling project will have a time horizon of some 50, perhaps 100 years. On making prices tell the truth, I'm tired of waiting until economists agree on externalities and politicians agree on internalizing those. They are discussing about that since 40 years and nothing is happening. I am proposing instead, actually developed in the China Council for China, the idea of increasing, artificially increasing resource prices, in particular energy prices, in parallel with documented efficiency gains, so that the average monthly payments for energy services, etc., remain constant. The Chinese love that idea. And the idea is actually emulating the success story of wages rising in parallel with labor productivity. rise labor productivity, the workers can fight for higher wages and can be successful, and that makes more incentive for more labor rationalization. And this ping-pong went on 150 times or so, leading to a 20-fold increase of labor productivity and a 20-fold increase of wealth. But today, labor is not in short supply, otherwise we wouldn't have that unemployment problem, while resources are in short supply. So we better establish the ping-pong with the scarce resource. And to avoid social and industrial problems, we can have lifeline tariffs, as they have in South Africa for the poor, and revenue neutrality for vulnerable industrial sectors so that they don't migrate. This can be done. Coalitions of the willing. Well, that's a big one. Hardly any progress on the climate conference. I spoke with Connie Hedegaard a moment ago. And at Copenhagen, even a coalition of the unwilling met and excluded the Europeans. So who are the winners of a climate policy that is combined with a dramatic innovation in climate-friendly technologies? I believe Europe, East Asia, and developing countries scarce of fossil fuel resources could be the winners. And the losers are those with absurdly high greenhouse gas emissions. So let's create a coalition of the winners. To get developing countries on board, we have to agree on something like equal rights on our atmosphere. That's what Michael Wadley and the scientists against climate change are proposing. Actually, it's an old idea by Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narain and others. So, but it also never took off the ground. It so happens that the losers are the Anglo-American countries, which since the Thatcher-Reagan revolution have left all to the markets and dogmatically called the state the problem, not the solution. A better understanding of Adam Smith, and actually also of David Ricardo, can help restore the balance we need between state and markets, and between public and private goods. We definitely need the public goods, such as infrastructures, primary education, the environment, social dignity and justice, and long-term thinking and planning. And the opposite is Milton Friedman, who said the state should be reduced to 10% of the GDP, and the rest, 90%, is the markets. And those 10% are essentially police and military. And on engaging the young generation, we want to reactivate our rebellious youth organization, formerly called the TT30, for think tank around 30 years of age. And the experience with the changing course conference has been very, very encouraging. This was the reflection of Graham Maxon. All I've said can be summarized as reinventing the Club of Rome. It is not a top-to-bottom process. It's not that I am having a blueprint kind of thing. No. The CoR presidents and secretary general can only catalyze and support the new movements from below. We hope it will be as rebellious and responsible as Aurelio Pacelli has been at his time. And I am very much excited, delighted, meeting the young people who are really behind that new agenda. And maybe some of you people in the audience feel also motivated to join. Thank you.
Again, I'm sticking to the limits of my speech, because the most important speech will follow, and the most important act of the day. So, Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, honorable guests and friends, dear Professor Temmerman, or should I say dear Mama Dakhtari. The challenge is great. How do I introduce a guest of honor who lived more diversified lives than most of us and is still far from retirement? How can I possibly draw a fair portrait of a person skillfully combining science and research with politics, policy making, and activism? The authoritative British medical journal, The Lancet, called Professor Temmerman a polymath. You know the word? A polymath is a person who is very knowledgeable in many different subjects, and indeed she is. But before sketching a rich career and successful achievements, let me tell you why we, at the Club of Rome EU chapter, wish to nominate her for honorary membership. It is because she is sharing values and opinions common within the Club of Rome. A holistic view of the world, not a fragmented vision of life on earth. Awe and wonder for the beauty of human life and for the planet Earth. Indignation and revolt against inequality, injustice, poverty, suffering, violence, pollution, and depletion of nature. And commitment, responsibility in her jobs and in society at large. From an early age, Belgian-born Marleen Temmerman wanted to go into a social profession, helping people, fighting injustice. Action in developing countries was also one of her youth dreams. It became an ambition, a project, a life project. Science, though, was not a primary interest, I heard. Politics, economy, languages much appealed to her. I was even told that she set up a literary club in a Flemish village of Kaprijke. However, a life project materialized by starting medical studies at the University of Ghent, and it did not prevent her from spending much time in following the courses of philosophers Leo Apostel and Jaap Kruithof, two progressive professors who inspired many youngsters in a time that dominant world views and values were challenged in the wake of May '68. Specializing in obstetrics and gynecology, she looked for a job in Africa. She went to Kenya in 1986 to take part in a study on HIV/AIDS, working with another distinguished Belgian, Dr. Peter Piot, at Nairobi University. A fascinating experience can be read in a book, Mama Daktari, Gynecology in Africa. For those who are not fluent in Swahili, Mama Daktari means mother doctor, if I'm right. Energetic and enterprising, Marleen Temmerman was active also on the field, working in a maternity hospital in Nairobi slums to compensate the shortage of local doctors. They had about 100 deliveries a day in very poor facilities. She therefore also raised funds to improve the condition of the hospital building and meet other material necessities. In 1992, she returned to Belgium, joining the University of Hospital of Ghent, the UZ. She became head of the gynecology unit, and under her impulse, the maternity section was renovated. Today, the UZ also hosts a children's hospital called Princess Elizabeth, after the name of your eldest daughter, Your Royal Highness. And I wouldn't be surprised that Marleen suggested the name. At any event, Marleen Temmerman became the first female professor of gynecology in Belgium. Quite an achievement for a position that had been long dominated by men only. It didn't stop her from still doing deliveries. In 1994, she was appointed founding director of the International Center for Reproductive Health, the ICRH, at the Ghent University. This center is multidisciplinary because, in the view of the initiators, public health is much more than medical care alone. It involves social scientists, social workers, lawyers, experts in human rights. And this multidisciplinary approach is very close at the heart of the Club of Rome. The ICRH headquarters is now counting more or less 30 staff and has satellite centers in several other countries. And I should particularly like to mention Kenya, as Professor Temmerman's husband, Lou Dirk, is chairman of the ICRH Kenya. Welcome here. I'm delighted that you are with us sharing the tribute we are paying to your wife, which is also a tribute to you, of course, and the family. The polymath we are honoring today also had a successful political activity in her home country. And you will not be surprised to hear that she joined a fairly new Green Party, Agalef, of which, by the way, I happen to have been one of the founding fathers in 1979. Unfortunately, we never met. Marleen is much younger than I am. You will have noticed it. And I left political life quite soon. Maybe we missed a chance. I'm sure we could have been a very successful team. She spent a short spell as city councillor in Ghent in 2001, I believe, but in 2004 moved to the Flemish Socialist Party, which had undergone a facelift and became the SPA, Socialistische Partij Anders, perhaps because that party became a bit more greener, as many other parties do today. At the Belgian federal elections in 2007, Marleen Temmerman was elected senator. She kept her job at the university, working only half-time in politics. Not an easy job, but being efficient and productive, she was re-elected in 2010 and even chaired the Committee for Foreign Affairs and Defense. In 2011, she became leader of the Socialist group in the Senate. For those who worked with her or observed her, it was obvious that she could have made a successful political career using that platform to defend her views on equality, justice, and health. But there are times in life that unexpectedly a new challenge is offered to you. The World Health Organization was recruiting a director for its Department of Reproductive Health and Research. It appealed to her, but there were not less than 260 candidates. Marleen thought she might fancy her chances, but nevertheless she applied for the job and she got it. The position was very demanding, both in terms of content and organization. The department is part of a cluster within the WHO called Families, Women and Children. It meant that it broadened the scope and the field of action for the new director. Not an additional burden for Professor Temmerman, but an opportunity to deal with a big societal problem, family planning, especially in the developing countries. Now, we all know that family planning is a touchy subject because of religious, cultural, and economic considerations. Talking about population control is difficult in many circles, even within those dealing with ecology and with the world problematic as we do in the Club of Rome. The subject is, of course, linked to the condition of the women in our society. You will not be surprised to learn that Marleen Temmerman is a committed feminist. Her strong views, though, are well balanced, based on the principles of equity and justice. Her approach is holistic, as is ours within the Club of Rome. You cannot put issues in boxes. If you do, you think within your box, and you never get a fair and sustainable solution. And family planning, as an example, has also to do with the exploitation of children as cheap labor forces. We in the rich industrial countries, of course, owe a large part of our wealth to the poverty of the world. This is revolting, and the indignity of Marleen Temmerman moves her towards an acute sense of action and a sense of responsibility. And with her driving force, she shakes and she moves people into action. She preaches investment in social and economic future, whereby the most efficient and needed step is investing in the first years of life in the physical and moral health of the children. There is a price to pay for all this. Her life is not an easy one, and she has to take care of herself. This busy bee is literally flying from one place to the other, from Geneva to New York, from Europe to Asia and Africa. But luckily for us, she also travels to Brussels to be with us, sharing the values of the Club of Rome. And, of course, the friendship of many former and present colleagues. Professor Temmerman has already an impressive collection of awards, but she's modest about it. When she received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the British Medical Journal in March 2010, she declared to be happy and proud, saying, "This award is important in the first place because it puts the subject I'm dealing with again under public scrutiny." Professor Temmerman was often a rebel and still is, a positive one. "I always wanted to make the world a better place," she said in many an interview. She is a pioneer, but also a transformer. The Club of Rome, we've seen it, has been a pioneer and is increasingly a transformer of visions and thoughts. So it will not surprise you, my dear guests, that the distinguished audience of the EU chapter, based in her native country of Belgium, nominated her for honorary membership. And as she often was the first woman to access the position long time held by males, she is also today the first female honorary member of the EU chapter of the Club of Rome. My board and I are very proud and happy about this. Reach the moon, then you will probably catch a star, said your mother, I heard. It's obvious that our guest of honor has already caught many stars and that this distinction will not be the last one. Professor Timmerman, Marleen, please.
Your Royal Highness, Commissioner, Minister of State, Minister of Education, Permanent Secretary of the Royal Flemish Academy, Excellencies, dear colleagues and members of the Club of Rome, Professor De Brul, thank you so much for this long laudatio, very well taken, thank you. Dear colleagues, friends, dear family, I'm very honored and pleased and very grateful to receive this honorary membership award of the Club of Rome, at the hands of the Royal Highness, thank you so much, and to join this prestigious organization that is now 45 years old and more necessary than ever. As we heard today in the excellent speech, the excellent Aurelio Pecci lecture of Professor Weizsäcker. Can I have my slides, please? Professor von Weizsäcker told us a lot about the history of the Club of Rome and argued for decoupling. I will, and you won't be surprised, concentrate in my address on the impact of population growth and overpopulation on the well-being of mankind, and elaborate briefly on some interventions that have not been mentioned, but that are more women-driven than the interventions we heard before. And it's not the first time, and I will just give you some citations that are not recent, because even Aristotle, philosopher very well known from before Christ, he said one would have thought that it was more necessary to limit population than property. The neglect of this subject, which is existing in existing states, is so common, is a never-failing cause of poverty among citizens. And poverty is the parent of both revolution and crime. Albert Einstein, overpopulation in various countries has become a serious threat to the health of people and a grave obstacle to any attempt to organize peace on this planet. Even from other sectors, Sam Levinson said, somewhere on this globe, every 10 seconds there is a woman giving birth to the child. She must be found and stopped. As a gynecologist, I don't fully agree on that. We also have to make our living, but he has a point. The father of the Green Revolution also, at that moment already, was pleading for human reproduction that must be curbed. Otherwise, the success of the Green Revolution will be ephemeral only. Most people still fail to comprehend the magnitude and the menace of what he called, not very friendly, the population monster. We can go on. Even the Pope, Paul VI, said there is no denying that the accelerated rate of population growth brings many added difficulties to the problem of development, where the size of the population grows more rapidly than the quantity of the available resources. So also religious leaders are aware and are concerned. In such circumstances, people are inclined to apply drastic remedies to reduce the birth rate. And there is no doubt that public authorities can intervene in the matter within the bounds of their competence. They can instruct citizens on this subject and adopt appropriate measures so long, and that is important of course, from the religious point of view, so long as these are in conformity with the dictates of the moral law and the rightful freedom of married couples is preserved completely intact. Environmentalists, those who fail to see that population growth and climate change are two sides of the same coin, are either ignorant or hiding from the truth. These two huge environmental problems are inseparable, and to discuss one while ignoring the other is irrational. The Under-Secretary General UN said family planning, and there it's more concrete and specific, family planning could bring more benefits to more people at less cost than any other single technology now available to the human race. And that has been again emphasized over and over again. The very well-known Sir David Attenborough also said the human population can no longer be allowed to grow in the same old, uncontrolled way. If we do not take charge of our population size, nature will do for us. And he continues, as I see it, humanity needs to reduce its impact on the earth urgently. And there are three ways to achieve this. And basically, you can summarize my presentation in those three concepts. One, we can stop consuming so many resources, has been also addressed by the previous speaker. We can change our technology, and that was decoupling, part of it. And we can reduce the growth of our population. And I think also this should be taken into the equation. In the different population conferences and in the Rio conference, we hear about the resources management, but the growth of the population and overpopulation is hardly mentioned and is not, or insufficiently, in my view, taken into the balance. One thing you can say is that in places where women are in charge, and this is said by a man, women are in charge of their bodies, where they can have the vote, where they are allowed to dictate what they do and what they want, whether it is proper medical facilities for birth control. In these regions, in this area of the world, the birth rate falls. Then there was a striking quote from a minister of Zimbabwe with a very high population growth, who said in '85, of course I know our economic growth can't match our population, 3.5%. So of course I know we'll all get poorer until we get that number down. Don't tell me, tell the other idiots. And then very well-known Karan Singh, Maharaja, philosopher, professor, politician. In '74, he led the Indian delegation to the World Population Conference in Bucharest. And he said, development is the best contraceptive. If you develop economic development, you allow women to education, to the labor market, automatically this will lead to a reduced family size. 20 years later, he adjusted his statement, and in '94, in the ICPD, the population conference, he said, contraception is the best development. Both go hand in hand. Mr. McNamara, past president of the World Bank, short of nuclear war itself, population growth is the gravest issue the world faces. If we do not act, the problem will be solved by famine, riots, insurrection, and war. And we have seen that in different places. Also, Kofi Annan, former UN Secretary General, has confirmed and reiterated several times that the global greenhouse gas emission reduction also are dependent on population size. And he introduces, that was after '94, where for the first time the concept of sexual and reproductive health and rights was introduced in the population conference in 1994. And reproductive health is one of the key tools in the wider battle against poverty. We all know, of course, the work former Vice President Al Gore with his Inconvenient Truth. Those who haven't seen it, please have a look. And then in the UK House of Lords, Baroness, now women becoming more and more in the picture and pleading also for women's rights, population control, and so on. And saying that while the global population reaching the milestone of 7 billion, population size is starting to get the attention it deserves. One of the most effective contributions would be to enable women to decide on their own family size and timing through funding universal access to family planning and enabling their social rights. And of course, Hillary Clinton doesn't miss one opportunity to also stress the rights of women. Also, recently, science, literature, academic constituencies have published, I'm not going to read it all, but these are some key publications of the last decades where, again, over and over again, emphasis is put on the population growth from, we say, 7 million to 9 billion, to 9 billion in 2050. Some are more pessimistic and are giving us figures more than 11. Female education and family planning are coming back all the time as very cost-effective and absolutely necessary intervention. Also, our own research group at the University of Ghent has published a paper in The Lancet with a key question elaborating on the Lancet series, where the Earth and human behavior and technology will be capable of providing enough food and resources. And there I want just to hold 1 minute to give you this. You can find it in the paper, but very briefly, because this is important. We talk about the global footprint. We talk about our ecological footprint that we have to keep down low. I mean, that's what we say. That's not what we do, at least not in this part of the world. But what is now the ecological footprint? Well, you can see the definition there on the slide. And basically, it is what is needed to the number of hectares per capita that are needed at the current way of spending globally in the world. It's 2.7 hectares per capita. What the biocapacity, that is the capacity of our ecosystems to produce biological materials and to absorb carbon dioxide that we, humankind, produces, we need, there is available 1.8. So you can see that we are already overspending a lot. 2.7, that's what we use. 1.8 is available. But this is, of course, it's not equally distributed in the world. If you look at the ecological footprint, and the figures are already a little bit outdated, it's getting worse. Of the States and Europe, it's much more than in other parts of the world, 1.2 in low-income countries. And as was said already by Professor van Weizsäcker, this emerging dynamic economies, they are also claiming their part of the wellness, and they also want technology, they also want to use the way we live, the way we are living. And look at who is emitting the most carbon dioxide. It's nothing new, but it's us. It's the United States, the Russian Federation, Europe. We are the big consumers. And amazingly, this cartoon that is already from 1994 still expresses us, kind of the overweight, the rich population. And you can't see it maybe very well, but the tiny little figures that are kind of are jumping overboard, we are calling them reduce your population, because we need more resources. So this is kind of impossible to maintain. We have to do something about it. Now, what do we do about it? And I'm not going to say that population control is the only intervention. I'm very happy to hear that there's more technology available, and we have to be very careful. It's a sensitive topic, because people are sometimes accusing us that we in the West, we are telling the populations in developing countries to limit and to use contraceptives so that we can live the way we do. Now, a few slides on why Do we have a population or a development crisis right now? Why do we have overpopulation? Why do we grow so fast? You can see the figures. We are going up very quickly. And this is the first time in history, because if you look at all the million years before, you see that only at the end, the population now is really escalating. And why is that? Because of the demographic transition. Before, we used to die much earlier. In some African countries, even now, the life expectancy is about 40 years old. Here, it's 80 and higher. So the death rate has gone down. We make the same amount of children or even more, and we live longer, which is very positive, which is very good, but that results, of course, in more population. So the current trends, as I said already, some say from 7 to 9 billion, other estimates range from 8 to 11. But whatever estimates we are using, we are growing very fast. What can we do about it? Do we have to adapt the China model, where the one-child policy was kind of dictated by the government? It resulted in maybe 300 million, 400 million less Chinese who are born in that period of time. But of course, it doesn't go with human rights, because it's a human right to decide when you want to be pregnant, how many children do you want. So it's a very difficult balance. What we are pleading for is that at least those women who want to limit their families, who want to use family planning, that at least they have access to it. Because the lack of reproductive health and contraception, the lack of women's rights and poverty is really some of the situations where we can work. And that was, for me, one of the reasons why, as you heard in the presentation, why I decided last year to go then to WHO to try, from that office in the World Health Assembly, to try to push this agenda forward. Because the family planning agenda has been neglected for many, many years. Over 50 years, we didn't talk about family planning. And now last year, there was the big family planning summit in London, where governments, UN, private sector, civil society came together and say, we have to do something about it. And it was a very specific target. It's called Family Planning 2020. Why? The target is that right now there are a lot of women, and according to the Guttmacher Institute, there are more than 220 million women in the world, girls and women, who want to avoid a pregnancy, who don't want to get pregnant now, maybe later, maybe not anymore. Maybe they are happy with their family size, but 220 million women who want to get pregnant and who don't have access to family planning. So if we could start reaching those women, that would already have a tremendous impact on population growth, on population side, without forcing there is some coercion from government, from families, from society, but trying to avoid coercion from a human rights perspective. Let's try to meet the need of the women who want it. But women are often disadvantaged in relation to men in many developing countries. They have limited access to education, together with a traditional lower status of women that limits women's opportunity to develop independent economic roles or to achieve positions of authority within the society. Traditions of early marriage, it's not only access to contraception, it's women's rights. It's women's rights to education, right to decision-taking. Autonomy and authority. Imagine that every day in the world, 38,000 girls are married. The age of 12, 13 years old, they are married. Sometimes they are raped or they are abused, and the next day they marry. So that's conjugal rights, and there is no rape anymore or no abuse. This happens every day in our world. So we have to be able to stop that. We have to kind of invest in girls and women in education in the first place, but also in access to healthcare and to family planning. Early marriage typically leads to larger families and can result in a greater prevalence of maternal death, maternal injury related to childbirth. Following marriage, a woman's lack of economic independence coupled with very patriarchal transitions means that her ability to determine the number and the spacing of her children is limited. Women are also much more vulnerable. We hear it every day. Look at what happened in India and in other countries. Vulnerable to violence and sexual assault, but also here, studies in our own country show that 20% of women once in their lifetimes are victims of violence, both within, outside marriage, and this is further reducing their ability to play a full and independent role. We believe that the evidence shows that empowered women typically choose to have smaller families. For environmental, so this is important, for health reasons, for women's health, for children's health, but also for their participation in economy and for environmental and sustainability reasons, as well for equity and justice. We strongly support gender equality and empowerment of women. And this includes full participation of girls and women in education, allowing full participation of women in personal and family decision, discouraging teenage marriage and teenage pregnancies, granting women full equality under the law and in the property rights, because in many countries women have no right to inherit land or property. Ensuring business run by women have access to finance and government support, which is often not the case in many countries. And we know that in the microeconomics, we have been living in Kenya for many years, investing in microeconomic projects in women was more return on investment than in men. I'm sorry to say so, but that is being proven by research and studies. Therefore, we call for improvement in the way sex and relationships are taught in schools, preferable by trained teachers who are comfortable with the subject, lifting of all the restrictions on the advertising on reproductive health services and products, making access to contraception, including emergency contraception, easier and more affordable, and making family planning a top priority. And that's what this initiative, Family Planning 2020, tries to do, where one tries to reduce with a budget of about $3.1 billion per year, but the pledges are there, from private sector mainly, also from governments, but mainly from the private sector. And here we have to acknowledge the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who is providing more than half of the money to be able to reduce the number of women who want to have to limit their families from 220 to 110 by the year 2020. Also, it's not only private sector, governments, UN, but also more and more, like now very recently, in May this year, parliamentarians from 34 countries were together in London, and they joined with other societies and constituency a very call for action and a powerful message to policymakers who are planning the future framework for international development. We heard already about this framework where we want women's rights, girls' rights to have a key position because they are a key driver of social and economic development. And they went on to demand that the G8 and the G20 leaders place family planning in the context of sexual and reproductive health and rights at the core of the post-2015 development agenda. And to end, in addition to the recent Rio Plus conferences, there will be two very important worldwide events that will put population and family planning related issues on the global agenda, which is one, the International Conference on Population and Development. The last landmark was in 1994. So next year will be the ICPD plus 20, where the sexual and reproductive health agenda has to be in the forefront. And secondly, the post-2015, what does it mean? You all know about the Millennium Development Goals. They are ending in 2015. But the world is now already thinking about what are the indicators, what should we do after 2015? And the emphasis will be on energy, on resources. But we should not forget the social development indicators. And maternal health, women's health, access to school, and so on is one of the very important indicators. And in this context, governments, policymakers, scientists, and civil society organizations will have to work together and to find ways, together with the Club of Rome, I hope, to slow down the population growth while fully respecting democracy, human rights, and cultural integrity. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope I convinced you that there is a problem in this Earth, that we need 5 Earths, maybe, and there is a problem with global warming. And for those who are not convinced yet, maybe my last slide will make it clear that the Earth is warming. Thank you.
Marleen, on behalf of the board of the Club of Rome EU chapter, but I think also on behalf of all participants today, take those flowers. They are colors you like, a bit reddish, a lot of green. That's what we both like. But thank you very much indeed.